delighted to introduce Leah Stokes, who is an assistant professor at University of California, Santa Barbara, in their Department of Political Science, and also affiliated with the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management. She has a terrific new book that she's going to be talking about today from Oxford University Press called Short Circuiting Policy, Interest Groups in the Battle Over Clean Energy and Climate Policy in the American States. Leah, in short order, has become one of the leading climate communicators and has done terrific work in making the case for why this issue is important and in tracking the statements of different presidential candidates and their party platforms. So if you're not following Leah on Twitter, you're missing out. And she has written for a variety of public outlets as well on her research. And so we're really fortunate to have her with us today to talk about her new book that is hot off the presses. So Leah, the floor is yours, and thanks so much for joining us here today at UT.
Well,
Yes.
Thank you so much for having me, Carrie and Josh, and I'll share my slides here in a minute. Yeah, you know, my book deals a fair amount with Texas, actually. So there's 2 chapters in the book about Texas. So I was very excited to have the chance to come and talk with you a little bit about that. And I'm going to focus a little bit of my talk near the end about the Texas case. So yeah, as Josh mentioned in his kind introduction, I'm a professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and I work on climate policy and clean energy laws. And I just published this new book called Short Circuiting Policy, Interest Groups, and the Battle Over Clean Energy and Climate Policy in the American States. And the unfortunate thing, of course, is that none of us can travel, but in some ways I've been enjoying doing this low carbon book tour from my house and being able to garden. So thanks so much for hosting me today. So the way that I often start this out is with something called the narwhal curve, and it's relevant because just yesterday I released a little film or video that I made with my older sister, who is a video journalist, and we try to capture the ideas behind this image in that piece. So if you're interested in watching that, it's released with Grist, and it's up on YouTube, and it's also on Twitter, so you can watch it. It's just a 3-minute video that gives you sort of the 101 of some of the arguments in the book. So the narwhal curve is just this idea that we need to create benchmarks for where we need to be going on clean energy by what date. And I think that the IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which some of you might be familiar with, they're a scientific body that works across the planet with scientists from all around the world that writes reports about climate change. And they came out with a report at the end of 2018 about what do we need to do to keep warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And that report really sparked a lot of interest globally. People started to ask, wow, how can we keep warming to a safe level? Not that warming at the level that we're already at, so we've already warmed the planet by 1 degree Celsius. Not that that is safe for many people around the world. You know, droughts across the western United States are more prevalent because of climate change, wildfires, etc. I'm sure there are heat waves, for example, in Texas to a greater degree than in the past. So we already have dangerous climate change, but how do we maybe limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius? And to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, what we need to be doing is cutting our emissions globally by about half by 2030. That's what the report says. So what I tried to do is think about what do we have to do on clean energy in the United States to meet those kinds of targets. And before that report came out and before the Sunrise Movement and the Democratic primary, a lot of people were talking about 2050 as the target for when we need to do these things. And so I started out by using that deadline. And what you can see here is if you think about 2050 as a time period where we need to have our electricity system cleaned up, it might seem like we're on track, right? If you start in the year 2000 and you go out to 2050, what you need is for the grid to clean up by 2 percentage points every year. Because if you just think about 100, divide by 50, you get 2. So 2 percentage points every year. And in some sense, we're at that. So in 2018, we were at about 36% of the grid was clean. But what do you notice if you look at this graph? You'll notice that nuclear and hydropower have been mostly flat over this period. The fact is that most hydropower in the United States is already developed, and you know, we're not building a lot of new nuclear plants because of public opposition as well as cost. So what we've been doing is really living on borrowed time, where we've been slowly ramping up renewables and kind of keeping pace with what we might need to do by 2050. But especially when we think about nuclear plants retiring, this is not fast enough. And if you want to think about 2030 as your target instead, which groups like the Sunrise Movement and Senator Bernie Sanders have really elevated as a target, you can see here that we are very far behind. You know, we need to be ramping up renewables a lot faster. And especially if you say, I don't like nuclear, I don't want nuclear to count as clean energy, which some people say, well, actually that makes it even harder. You need to be moving even faster on renewable energy. So the reason why I talk about these curves in the book is to try to help people understand what is the pace of change in the clean energy deployment space compared to what is necessary. And the takeaway is we are not moving fast enough. Now, there are several laws at the state level in the United States that have fueled the progress that we've seen so far. And those are the things that I cover in my book. So these are renewable portfolio standards and net metering laws. Renewable portfolio standards were an idea that was developed in the 1990s. Actually, a woman named Nancy Rader was key to developing this idea, and she worked with a network of advocates across the country that the foundation, the Energy Foundation, funded. These were groups like the Union of Concerned Scientists, the Environmental Defense Fund, many others. And what they would do is they would get together and they would debate, how are we going to try to scale up renewables? Because one thing I talk about in the book is the history of the renewable energy industry. And what happened was in the 1970s, when Carter was the president, there was a push to try to build out this industry. But by the 80s, with Reagan, a lot of the support went away, and the industry really fell into a dark period. There were a lot of bankruptcies, projects were abandoned, it was a difficult time. In the 1980s, more clean energy was built in California than anywhere else in the world. The US was way ahead of the globe in terms of clean energy, but in the after the Reagan administration, the U.S. lost its leadership, and countries like Denmark, for example, pulled ahead in things like wind energy. So that's that history. And in the 1990s, these advocates were trying to figure out, well, what can we do? And they came up with two big policies that they ended up getting passed in most states across the country. And that's the Renewable Portfolio Standard and net metering laws. Renewable portfolio standards are a pretty simple idea. They basically say this is how much clean energy or renewable energy we will have by a given date. And over time, the emphasis has become more on clean energy, which includes nuclear, because nuclear is carbon-free, as opposed to renewable energy, which does not include nuclear. And in general, how those laws were defined varied state by state. So for example, in Pennsylvania, coal bed methane. So when you're mining for coal, there's often methane that is captured or leaking with that mining. And so that was included under Pennsylvania's renewable portfolio standard as a renewable resource. And of course, that's a fossil fuel, so that's a questionable choice. And there are also big debates about whether or not biomass, for example, should count. So this law became very popular and was passed in a couple places in the 1990s, which I talk about in the book, including Texas. But then huge waves happened in the early 2000s where all these states got on board. And I'll show you that actually a lot of these laws were passed by Republican governors. A lot of them were sponsored by Republican legislators. So it was a bipartisan idea for a long time. Net metering laws are the idea that if you want to put solar on your roof, how should you be compensated by your utility? So the way the electricity system works in most places, although not Texas, is that there's a monopoly utility, and you don't get to choose who you get electricity from. And so what if you wanted to sell electricity to your utility and not just buy it? Well, advocates worked, again, in the 1990s and early 2000s to make sure that people who wanted to sell solar electricity would have a way to do that. And that's called net metering. And again, there was an advocate named Tom Stars who went across the country and was supported by the Energy Foundation and managed to pass this policy in a lot of places. In the early periods, both of these laws were not controversial and they were fairly bipartisan. But what I chart in my book is the politicization of these laws as electric utilities and fossil fuel companies learn more about the policies and come to understand that they are not in their financial interest to support these laws, and they come to attack them over time. So that is the interest group backlash that really forms the bulk of this book. So what you may know is that Fossil fuel companies and electric utilities for more than 30 years have promoted climate denial. They've spent billions of dollars. We don't even know how much it is, but there's been some good reporting trying to figure that out. But billions is definitely the case, saying that climate change is not real and sowing confusion and doubt. But that's not the only thing they did. They also have been pushing climate delay. They've been trying to block policies from getting passed that would enable climate policy, and they've been trying to weaken and roll back all these existing laws that I talked about, the Renewable Portfolio Standard and the net metering laws. And they use a variety of tactics to try to repeal these laws. And that's the focus of my book here. So they do things like lobby. A lot of fossil fuel lobbyists, especially in Texas, which I talk about in detail, have very strong relationships with legislators. In Texas, the state legislature only meets for 6 months every 2 years. That's called an unprofessionalized legislature. And what happens in cases like that, we know from political science research, is that the legislators don't have as much knowledge, right? They're not working full time to try to figure out policy or pass the best laws. They have other things. They often have other jobs. So that means that they outsource a lot of their ideas and work to lobbyists. And so particularly in Texas, the fossil fuel industry maintains extremely strong ties with specific legislators who work on the energy file. And I document that in detail in my book. But they don't just try to influence the people writing the laws, the legislators. They also try to influence the people implementing the laws. These are bureaucrats through the executive branch. And in the case of electricity, that happens through public utility commissions. So the Texas Public Utility Commission is the one that I write about in the Texas case. And what they do, and particularly you see this with the Texas Solar Energy Law that was passed in 2005, is they go and they say, don't implement this law because that wasn't the legislative intent, or you shouldn't actually make it enforceable. So I call that implementation resistance. And a lot of people focus on the spectacle of policymaking, right? It's very exciting. We're going to get a bill passed. Oh, wow, what will it do? But they forget that the rubber hits the road during implementation. How that law is finalized in terms of rules and regulations is really critical, because sometimes we have laws passed, like at the federal level, like the Clean Air Act amendments that included a requirement to do something about mercury emissions. And that law from 1990 only gets finalized after 2010. So we're talking more than 2 decades before a law is implemented in that case. So implementation is really critical, and it's something that we don't always pay enough attention to, whether we're political scientists, policymakers, or the public. And one thing I do in my book as well is I fielded a survey with state legislators across the country and their staff, and I asked them about implementation. And it's true that they are not paying as much attention to implementation as maybe they could or should be. The other way that advocates try to change policy is not as directly as working directly with legislators and directly with bureaucrats. These are what you could call indirect strategies. And if you're familiar with the work of Schatzschneider, this is a very important early political scientist who worked on how interest groups change our policy. He talked a lot about expanding the scope of conflict, which is the idea that you don't just need to talk to politicians. If the politicians aren't listening to you, you can make the fight bigger, and you can bring in other actors in society. And of course, one thing you can do is you can work through the party system. So I document the ways that interest groups have been using primaries to try to drive polarization on clean energy and climate policy. And I'll talk more about that later. The other thing they do is they try to use the public. So they say run fake campaigns that claim that the public is very upset about clean energy when they're not. And I'll give an example of that from Kansas later on. In a more honest way, they could also organize the public, which is this idea of outside lobbying, a term that Coleman came up with. And that idea is, if you've ever read Olson's work, corporations have a lot easier job getting together because they don't have as much of a collective action problem, right? There aren't that many corporations, they can organize themselves. And you see that extremely clearly in the Texas case, where there are 2 big lobby groups for the fossil fuel industry. That's the Texas Industrial Energy Consumers, which lobbies the Public Utility Commission in Texas, and the Texas Association of Manufacturers, which lobbies the legislature. And these are, not that many companies who easily get together and say, this is what our interest is to get this done. So let's all get together, hire a lobbyist, pool our money, and get good things to happen. But if the public wants good things to happen, it would take millions of Texans, or hundreds or thousands, and it's much harder for them to be organized. So one thing that interest groups do is they organize the public. And that's what this idea of outside lobbying is. And by organizing the public, they get the public to then lobby politicians. And the last way that the expansion of the scope of conflict plays out is through court cases. So if a law gets passed and it's maybe facing implementation and interest groups don't like it, they can challenge the law legally and say that this is not the way it should be implemented, and that can really delay climate policy. And I write about that in various cases, such as the way PURPA was delayed through utilities challenging that law in the 1980s. Oh, I lost my screen. Now let me just do that again. So the theory of this book is based on the idea of policy feedback. This might be a concept you've heard about in your political science classes before. A lot of times we think about what kind of political situation, who do we need to elect to the US Senate? Who needs to be the president? What kind of political situation will lead to the policy that we want, climate policy? But we can reverse that relationship and think about, if we pass a climate policy, how will that reshape the political system? And that is the idea of policy feedback, that you can pass laws that bolster new interest groups who come to have more power over time, and that those laws can be locked in through a kind of virtuous cycle. So one idea behind the Renewable Portfolio Standard was that it would create new clean energy companies who would come to have more power and influence in state legislatures, like in Texas, and they would lobby the state legislature to expand the law. And I'm going to talk about exactly how that played out in Texas, because Texas is a really good example of positive feedback. However, it's a little bit more complicated than the way the existing literature has talked about it. So one of the ideas that I develop in terms of building on this theory of policy feedback is this idea of the fog of enactment. Basically, the idea is that if you're passing a law, whether that's Trump's tax cuts or the Texas clean energy laws, these are really complex bills. And that means that the legislators themselves, as well as interest groups, can often struggle to understand what these laws are going to do. And again, in that survey that I did with state legislators and their staffers, I found that many of them said that they didn't know what these laws would do during implementation. So it's only after the laws are implemented and the rubber hits the road that the resources that policy feedback points to getting redistributed between this interest group to that interest group, that's where that process actually happens. So that means there's a lot of ambiguity and uncertainty when the laws are passed, and that ambiguity and uncertainty gets clarified when resources are getting redistributed after the implementation process. Now, that can work very well for the clean energy advocates or climate advocates in the early time periods. But unfortunately, what happens is when you pass a new law in one state, eventually after implementation, people learn. And utilities who are networked across the country through organizations like the Edison Electric Institute, they talk to one another and they learn that they don't like these laws, and they come to attack them in later acting states. So that means it might be easier to get one law passed in one place because you can kind of catch your opponents off guard, but over time it gets harder and harder to do that. So the model, this is just, again, building on the slide from 2 ago that I talked about at depth, is after the policy is in place, what happens to the political system? So that's that feedback process that we're talking about. And what I show is all the complex ways that political actors, namely interest groups, can try to reshape the political system after policy change. And they can do that through the 2 direct ways that I talked about, the lobbying directly to legislators or giving legislative contributions, building relationships with them, etc. Or they can work directly with bureaucrats. And then there are the 3 indirect ways that I've talked about. So they can go through the parties by trying to play in primaries and giving money to this kind of politician, not that kind of politician. They can go through the public, through either astroturfing or outside lobbying, or they can go through the courts. So it's a complex model, but the way to think about it is, what are all the ways that a fossil fuel company or an electric utility is trying to resist the clean energy transition? And this image gives you a sense of all the myriad ways that they do it, both directly and indirectly. So this is a more simple picture of that idea, and it draws on some images that I'm sure you're familiar with about how a bill becomes a law, right? So policy feedback starts the story not with who's in charge of the Senate or who's the governor or president. It starts after the law is passed, and it thinks about the way policy reshapes the political landscape. So a bill becomes a law, and then it kickstarts a bunch of political changes. So one of the political changes that it does is that it redistributes resources between advocates and opponents. If you pass a clean energy standard, suddenly wind energy companies are going to start growing in Texas, and other companies, electric utilities burning coal and natural gas, might struggle to make as much money off of their existing assets. So that's that redistribution. Now the interest groups, they don't just sort of electric utilities and fossil fuel companies don't go, gee shucks, we lost that first round and clean energy is just going to win. They fight back, and they can do that directly by lobbying legislators, but they can also do it indirectly by working through the public. So let's talk a little bit about what that is. So when you work with the public, as I've talked about, you can do it in an honest way where you are, let's say, a solar leasing company, something like the former Solar City, which is now part of Tesla, or a company like Sunrun. These are the solar leasing companies that help people put solar on their roofs. And what they can do is go and find their customers and say, hey, our solar policy is getting attacked. Let's all band together and write letters and show up to the government or show up to the Public Utility Commission and protest. And that is a kind of outside lobbying. There's real people who have real opinions, and what companies are doing is mobilizing them. But companies can also do it in a much less honest way, and that is called astroturfing. Here's an example of that from Kansas. What happened was Koch Industries, which you may have heard of, a big fossil fuel company headquartered in Wichita, Kansas. This is the Koch brothers, you've probably heard of. They have a big lobbying organization called Americans for Prosperity. And Americans for Prosperity is kind of like a political party. It's not exactly like the Democrats, the Republicans. It's kind of like the Tea Party or something like that. And what they do is they organize across the country, and they try to block clean energy laws. So in Kansas, they wanted to get rid of a clean energy law. And so a lobbyist registered a new group. I think it was the Kansas Seniors Alliance. And, you might think, oh, wow, a bunch of Kansas seniors are really upset about electricity bills, or they're worried about this policy. But when journalists went to go understand, well, who exactly is behind this group? There was no website, there was no contact. The only person they could find was the lobbyist for a lawyer that worked for the lobbyists for Americans for Prosperity and Koch Industries. So it didn't actually seem like it was a real group of Kansas citizens who were worried about their electricity bills. It was a fake group that pretended like Kansas seniors were worried. And they made these flyers and sort of sent them all over the place to create a feeling for Kansas legislators that this clean energy law was unpopular, even though it is actually really popular. And the same thing plays out all across the country, and I document lots of examples of this in my book. One of my favorite examples was written about in The Nation, and it is about a utility called Entergy and what they did in New Orleans. They wanted to build a new natural gas plant, which is fossil gas. It's a fossil fuel. And so they hired actors. I believe they spent something like $25,000 to hire actors to go to the city council meeting and to say that they really hated solar and they really liked natural gas. And when a journalist showed up and he started to ask these people at this meeting, hey, why are you here? Why do you hate solar? Why do you like natural gas? They said, oh, I was paid to come here. They were literally paid to show up. And that is not the way public engagement is supposed to happen. We're not supposed to have corporations using money to make fake versions of what the public wants. And yet electric utilities are doing this all across the country, and fossil fuel companies are doing it as well. And that is this idea of astroturfing, fake grassroots campaigns. Now, of course, that isn't the only way that interest groups work indirectly to shape laws. They also use the party system. And I argue that some of the polarization we've seen in modern American politics is driven by interest groups putting a wedge between Republicans and Democrats on issues like climate change and clean energy. And how do they do this? What they do is, let's say you are a Republican in Kansas, like somebody named Russ Jennings. This is a Republican from the western part of the state. He is pro clean energy. And, you know, he's supporting wind energy because his community in western Kansas has gotten a lot of new investment. Just like if you were to talk about the panhandle of Texas, there are poorer Republican areas that have gotten investment in wind energy that have boosted, for example, local tax revenues, right? And so these Republicans are pro clean energy. Well, what happens is when if they vote the wrong way on a bill, let's say they vote to keep a clean energy law and not get rid of it, they start to face pressure from lobbyists for groups like Americans for Prosperity and Koch Industries or the Kansas Chamber of Commerce. And that's exactly what happened to Russ Jennings. And in fact, there was another Republican named Scott Schwab who wrote some emails that say explicitly that he was being leaned on very heavily by lobbyists for Americans for Prosperity and Koch Industries to try to repeal this clean energy law. But they weren't doing it publicly. And, you know, he was worried that if he didn't change his vote on this issue, that he would face a primary challenger. Because what these interest groups threaten is they say, if you don't vote the right way on this issue, if you're not anti-climate change or anti-clean energy, we are going to stop giving you money for your re-election campaign. And in fact, we might just fund a primary challenger for you. And you have to understand that for a lot of these state legislators, they're not getting money from everybody. They get a lot of money from Koch Industries directly, from the Kansas Chamber of Commerce, which itself gets money from Koch Industries directly, and from the Kansas Republican Party, which gets money from Koch Industries directly. So the fossil fuel industry has all these really tight ties and funnels a huge amount of money into the re-election campaigns. And let's say you're Russ Jennings and you still say, no, I'm still going to support wind because that's the right thing to do for my district. Well, then you get a primary challenger. And everybody else who's a Republican is watching that happen. And they're thinking, gosh, I don't want to be on the wrong side of this. I don't want to deal with this stuff. And so they all move. So if, let's say, Russ Jennings gets kicked out, now we've got a new Republican in office who's anti-renewables, and that drives to polarization. But even if that doesn't happen, all the other politicians are watching, and they come to shift their position so that they don't have to deal with these kinds of attacks. At the federal level, you can see this really clearly in the case of Bob Inglis. Bob Inglis was a Republican congressman from South Carolina who was pro-climate change, and he faced a big primary challenger funded by the fossil fuel industry because of his position. John McCain as well, a senator formerly from Arizona, faced these kinds of issues. So polarization can be driven by interest groups very clearly. And you see this polarization play out in clean energy very clearly. So historically, as I mentioned, renewable energy laws had bipartisan support. You can see that in the 1990s and early 2000s, a lot of Republican governors were the ones who signed these things into law. Governor George W. Bush, for example, signed the SB 7 in 1999 into law, which created that first clean energy target in Texas. And in fact, he touted this when he was running for president. But you can see that in the much later years, that stopped happening and Republicans became hostile towards these policies. And I argue that's because fossil fuel companies and electric utilities are telling Republicans, we don't want you to take these positions anymore. And it's not just elites that are getting polarized. We know that the public often takes their cues about what to think about an issue from politicians. And so just as the politicians are getting polarized, so too is the public. So this gives you a sense that in 2006, 2007, climate change and clean energy were very bipartisan, strong support for acting on them. And in the intervening time period, Republican support fell off precipitously while Democratic support remained high and independent support was about in between. And you can see this pattern in lots of different data sets during this time period. So my argument is that interest groups were really key to driving this polarization. So the cases that I talk about in the book, I've sort of previewed some of them. I talk about Texas, and that's the sort of happiest story in my book when it comes to wind energy, because that's where we see this virtuous positive feedback cycle, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But the next chapter on Texas is not a happy story, and it's about the challenge to get solar laws on the books in Texas. I talk about the Kansas rollback of renewable energy laws, which, as I mentioned, Koch Industries was really key to. In Arizona, I talk about a utility called Arizona Public Service and really the corruption that they had in terms of influencing their regulator. And finally, in Ohio, there was a really terrible law passed last summer which rolled back renewable energy laws and energy efficiency laws and instead bailed out coal plants. And this is on the order of billions of dollars going to keep dirty coal plants open until 2040. If you're interested in that story, I wrote about it in The Guardian last summer, and of course it's also in the book. So let's talk a little bit about Texas to close this out here. So you might be familiar, it's a really famous story. Texas in 1999 passed a really important clean energy law. And what you might not know was that at that time period, there was an effort across the country and really across the world to change the way our electricity system worked, to stop having monopoly utilities and start having competition. And Texas went forward with that in 1999, and it was in that same law that we got the first renewable portfolio standard. And I tell the story of two NGOs that were really critical to getting that part of the law written into the bill. That is the Environmental Defense Fund, EDF, and Public Citizen. Now, a lot of people like to say that it was Governor George W. Bush who, championed renewables, and this is just not accurate. I went into the archives of some groups in Texas. Well, I went to Austin and did field work for this book, and I, copied hundreds of pages of archival documents and looked through all of the things that were written at the time. And earlier versions of the bill, or in fact, the governor put out this list of what he wanted to go into the restructuring bill, and it didn't include absolutely anything about renewables. This was not on his agenda. After the law was passed, he acted like it was on his agenda and that he was a champion of it, and he went and ran for president on that platform and on that record. But a lot of people read backwards and say that he was this clean energy champion, when if you look at the historical record at the contemporary time period, that's just not accurate. Now, the happy positive feedback story in Texas is that after this 1999 law, it was a huge success. Wind energy started to grow across the state, and I tell the story of Senator Frazier, who is a Republican from the Panhandle, who decides to champion clean energy. And so his office wrote an expansion of the law that increased the clean energy target and also famously put a lot of money into transmission expansion. What's so interesting about that transmission expansion is that it really speaks to this fog of enactment idea. I interviewed some opponents, lobbyists for the fossil fuel industry in Texas while I was there, and they said explicitly, had we known how much money would have been spent on transmission, we would not have allowed that provision to pass. So it was that ambiguity about how much money would go into transmission and how much of a difference it would make for the clean energy industry that allowed that provision to get into law. And that's in part because the bill was written so that the exact amount of money spent was not stipulated. Legislatures sometimes do this. They don't want to take the praise or the blame, mostly the blame, for spending a lot of money. And so they say, we'll punt that to the Public Utility Commission, the regulator, to decide. And so that was how a lot of money ended up getting spent on the transmission lines. Now, the solar energy law in Texas is not as positive of a story. So in that same bill that I was just talking about, the 2005 bill, there was also a requirement to build non-wind energy. This is something we called a carve-out or a solar carve-out, even though it wasn't called solar. The basic point is that if you set a renewable portfolio standard or a clean energy target, the cheapest thing is always going to be built, right? If I say, go build some renewables, you must. Well, what are you going to do? You're going to build the cheapest thing so you can make the most profit, right? And so that meant that there was basically no solar built. And so advocates were learning that they needed to get carve-outs, specific requirements to not just build the cheapest kind of renewables, but to build other types of renewables as well. And the advocates were successful. They managed to get this written into the law. But unfortunately, a lobbyist for the fossil fuel industry was present when the language was finalized for that bill. as I write about in the book, there was extremely strong ties between a lobbyist for the fossil fuel industry and Senator Fraser's office. So people told me things like when the legislature was in session, he basically had a desk in the office of Senator Fraser, and he would work out of that office regularly. So, you know, I don't have a desk in any legislators' offices. I can't imagine that clean energy advocates maintain desks in these people's offices, but that was how tight they were. A lot of people said that he was like best friends with the key staffer that was running this bill, that they would go biking together all the time. Other people pointed out that and I don't remember if it was the chief of staff, but a senior person in that office was actually married to a lobbyist in that same firm for the fossil fuel industry. So the ties between the lobbyist for the fossil fuel industry and the energy senator in the Texas legislature were like this. They were just really tight, which meant that if they were going to be finalizing the bill language, that person would get to sit in the room and write the exact language. And what that person did was he planted a little poison pill in the law, and per the fog of enactment, the advocates didn't know that it was happening. They did not understand the consequences of the way the law was written until implementation. So the law included two different words that had, according to the lobbyists later on, slightly different interpretations. At one point it said, we have a goal to build more renewables. And then it said, and we have a target to build non-wind renewables, aka solar. When the law went to be implemented at the Public Utility Commission, that lobbyist said that the law was written that way intentionally so that no non-renewables would be required, that it would just be voluntary. Now, if you pass a voluntary law like that, it does absolutely nothing. Unless you have it be mandatory, no new renewables that are not wind will get built. And that is exactly what happened. This became a huge battle. Several legislators actually wrote to the Public Utility Commission and said that their legislative intent was not being interpreted correctly. Governor Rick Perry got involved, and for a while it seemed like they might actually implement this law correctly, but they never ended up doing. And so the policy was never implemented. And if you imagine if Texas had passed a solar energy carve-out in 2005, you have to think that the state would be so much farther ahead on solar energy. Instead, it was states like California that really invested in that technology when it was more expensive and brought it down what we call the learning curve, which is when you make more of a technology, it gets cheaper, and basically subsidized solar for the rest of the country. Texas, meanwhile, basically was free riding off of that effort because they never implemented this law because of those tight ties between the fossil fuel industry and the legislature. So what I want to argue is that when you put Texas in context, it's not as green as many people like to say. Maybe some of you already know this, but Texas has a very bad record, for example, on energy efficiency. There's a lot of industrial facilities in the state that are really wasting an enormous amount of energy. It's not an efficient state. So that's one thing that we can talk about. But more generally, when it comes to renewable energy, Texas has the largest potential for solar of any state in the country. Just think about it. Texas is a really big state, and it's a very sunny state. So Texas could be way ahead of the rest of us in terms of the amount of solar that it makes. But instead, it's about 15 years behind because it never implemented that law that was passed in 2005. And even if you think about comparing it to the national benchmark, Texas got about 26% of its electricity from clean energy in 2018. That's the last year that we have up-to-date data for right now. And at that time, the national average was about 36%. So that's 10 points behind the national average. So I know that the wind energy industry in Texas has been lauded for being so great, and I can completely understand why that is, and I think that's wonderful. But I think that we have to benchmark what Texas is doing versus what it could be doing and versus what the rest of the country is doing. And when we do that, we see pretty clearly that Texas is very behind on cleaning up its grid, and also it's behind on energy efficiency. Now, many Texans get upset at me when I say this because there's such a narrative that Texas is the renewable energy leader and the wind leader. And I think that's definitely true on wind energy, but we have to ask ourselves, what is the plan to fully decarbonize the electricity system? And I do not think that Texas has a plan. So the last point I will make before closing is that my book also talks a lot about the history of climate denial and climate delay. So if you're familiar with the book Merchants of Doubt by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway, I build on that book here. But rather than focusing as much on the role that fossil fuel companies played in promoting climate denial, I unpack the ways that electric utilities have slowed us down from cleaning up our energy system. And that's done in basically three ways. First, they promoted a very wasteful energy system. If you burn fossil fuels on site at an industrial facility, there are so many of these in Texas, you can use energy more efficiently because you can get both the waste heat as well as the electricity that you're making, right? Because to make electricity, you burn something generally, you create steam, and that drives a generator and it makes electricity. Now the steam becomes waste, and so you lose sometimes like 30% or more of your energy from just that boiled water, basically. But at industrial facilities, you often need heat as well as electricity, and so you can use the heat. But unfortunately, in the mid-20th century, electric utilities pushed out all that industrial cogeneration, meaning that a lot more fossil fuels ended up getting burned than would have otherwise. So if you look at the early 20th century, huge amounts of industrial cogeneration was on site. And what electric utilities did is that they gave long-term, extremely cheap contracts to kind of predatorily get those facilities to shut down and build it all as a centralized system through coal plants. And that was very wasteful. The other thing they did is they promoted climate denial, and I've been doing a whole new research project documenting all the history of climate denial in the electric utility industry. And then, as the rest of the book outlines in detail, they've been working to weaken and roll back clean energy laws across the states. If you're familiar with this, if you're interested in this part of the book, you can also read a summary that I published on the news website, Drilled News. So if you want to get a copy of the book, which by no means is necessary, but it's quite hard to do because the book has been sold out since it came out, and with coronavirus, publishing is difficult. So I'll just spend 1 minute on how you can buy it. The best way to buy it is to go to the Oxford University Press website, and I have a discount code here where you get 30% off. So the book's about $20 in that scenario. And it may take a little bit to come because it's on back order and warehouses are struggling with coronavirus, but that is the best way to buy it. You can also get a copy of the ebook very easily on Amazon as a Kindle, and for whatever bizarre reason, the price is cheaper right now. So it was like $19 a week ago, and now it's like $15. And I think if you buy it on Google Play, it's only $10. So you can easily get a copy of the ebook for not that much money. And like I said, I'm not at all pushing you to buy a copy, but it's quite difficult to buy, so it's helpful for me to explain how you can buy it. So thank you so much for listening, and I guess we've got about 20 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes for questions. So I will let either Josh or Carrie look at the Q&A and encourage all of you to put in a question or two through the Q&A because I'd love to answer them.
All right, thank you, Leah. So Josh, I will let you, if you have an initial opening question, we do have some on the Q&A that I can ask. So Josh, do you have a question you might like?
Sure. I wanted to ask if there are good examples of renewables policy lock-in and interest group success over time in states other than California, particularly in red states. So I think your book goes into some detail about states like Texas where there was successful pushback, but I'm wondering if there's a story of successful lock-in and where we see it and what accounts for it.
Yeah, so I think you're right that California is sort of a shadow case in my book, meaning that I did a lot of work on California and I didn't write a whole chapter about it, in part because I could have written a whole book on California. It's so complicated and long. And I have all this material that I don't know what I'll do with. I'll write something else. Anyway, so California is the classic example. And I think the key variable there is something called the Intervenor Compensation Program, which is basically this policy that pays advocates to show up at the Public Utility Commission and advocate in the public interest for things like clean energy and lower electricity bills. Monopoly utilities, which is not the case in Texas, but in most other states, they get guaranteed profits. They have so much money that they can use to go to public utility commissions or legislatures and lobby and shape the policy. But advocates don't have those same resources. They need to go to foundations or get money from the public, it's just a lot harder for them. And so what an intervener compensation program does is it provides guaranteed money for advocates to be able to counterbalance some of these electric utilities and to provide an alternative view. And that exists in California. It costs people 17 cents a year to pay for this policy, and it returns hundreds of millions of dollars back to the public every year. There was an independent review done of this policy that found those facts and said that it was extremely successful. That policy only exists in a couple states, but I think it's really critical to be bolstering the advocates. And I'll say that the other happy story is Texas, the wind story in Texas. So the chapter in my book about the wind industry and the CREZ lines, this transmission build out, is a positive feedback story. I think that the wind industry in Texas and Oklahoma and Kansas has really matured. There's a lobby organization called the Wind Coalition, which, for example, when the policy was under attack in Kansas, fielded a political action committee, a big, fund to support these right-wing politicians who were being attacked. So, we're starting to have more political power from the clean energy industry, and I think within the wind belt, which includes Texas, some of those things are starting to happen. And I certainly think that the CREZ lines are an example of that positive feedback.
All right, thanks. So I'll ask a question from the audience here. It's a general question about the role of, let's just say, municipal utilities. We can think about Texas or other places, but there are many different types of, situations that customers find themselves in, or in terms of bringing electricity. Austin Energy, of course, is our municipal electricity provider here in Austin, and it has its own green policy plans and low carbon plans. So how do you view your sort of political economy discussion here in terms of different ways and different situations in which people buy electricity in terms of retail markets, municipal utilities, or investor-owned utilities?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something I get asked a lot because there are these campaigns in some places to try to change private utilities, IOU, investor-owned utilities, into municipal utilities or public utilities of some variety. So I write about that in the conclusion of my book. Of course, Austin Energy is a really great example of a muni that is at the cutting edge and has been for a long time. They've had values of solar tariffs. They've had really good progressive programs. So I think that munis can be really good. Unfortunately, that's not really the story everywhere, right? So, for example, in Florida, I don't remember the name of this muni off the top of my head, but there was a municipal utility that was attacking solar energy just the same way that the private utilities are doing through the Edison Electric Institute. So I don't think it's just a question of the ownership style of the electricity system being the critical variable that determines acceptance of clean energy or not. If you read this really fantastic book called Superpower, which it has a lot to do with Texas, and Michael Skelly, who lives in Texas, is the protagonist in the story. This is Richard Gold? I don't know why I can't remember. Gold's new book. And it's fantastic. And Russell, that's why. Russell Gold, sorry. And if you read that book, you'll see that the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is a federal, public utility in some sense, is absolutely terrible in terms of working with Michael Skelly, who's trying to develop new transmission lines and to bring in new wind energy. They just refuse to play ball or be at all constructive. So that's a really fascinating piece. So I think it's a bit of a mixed bag, and I'm doing a whole other research project slowly in the background to try to document what is the electricity mix of private utilities, municipal utilities, and there's actually a third type that we haven't talked about, which is rural electric co-ops that were part of the New Deal. They actually have a very dirty electricity mix. They have an enormous amount of coal assets in many cases. And so I'm trying to understand what is the electricity mix of all these different utilities, and does one utility necessarily mean it's better or worse? And I think the story is that it's actually very complicated, which doesn't mean that, there aren't really fantastic munis like Austin Energy, but I think it means that if we have choices about how to spend our time, perhaps it doesn't make sense to be spending our time trying to turn private utilities into municipal utilities. Maybe it makes more sense to try to be passing renewable portfolio standards or clean electricity laws or even carbon prices, things like that. So when we think about the scarce time that advocates have, I am not a huge supporter of these public power campaigns, although I know others have different views, and I'm very open to having a discussion about it.
Right, thanks. So now I'll ask a question a little bit more about Texas, since you had a lot of Texas comments in there. So that's sort of two questions. One, if you don't consider hydropower in sort of the electricity mix, would you think Texas is a little bit more on the cutting edge in terms of being low carbon electricity, say, with the wind and nuclear, given that we don't have a lot of rivers here and we're on the edge of where it rains and doesn't rain? So that's one question, hydro versus non-hydro considerations, which are more legacy. And the second is a question on should we consider Texas behind in solar adoption just because we don't have a carve out for solar or a specific policy to build photovoltaics, if the photovoltaics installations now are sort of really ramping up, and maybe in only 2 or 3 years, Texas might have more solar than any other state in the country, again, because we're big and we have good resources, but we have the wholesale market. In some sense, the other studies we've done here with colleagues on campus, I came to the conclusion that Texas just likes things that have economic development. And if it's low carbon, fine. If it's high carbon, fine. And they just wait for some other area, or California or Germany to, or a federal government perhaps, to say, help lower the price. And when it gets to the likings of the wholesale market, then they'll start building it. So how do you think about Texas' position in those contexts of hydro and future solar?
Yeah, so the facts that I gave about the electricity mix are including hydropower. So when I say it's 26% as opposed to 36% nationally, that includes hydropower. So when I'm counting clean energy, I'm counting nuclear, hydropower, wind, solar, geothermal, biomass, all that kind of stuff. I'm just cutting out natural gas and oil, very small percent of the mix, and coal. So yeah, even including hydropower, it's really not ahead of the curve. And everybody wants to talk about the merchant solar plants coming online and how ERCOT is going to facilitate that. And sure, I think that's true, but you have to remember that we're in 2020 now, and my book is about 2005 and the potential that was there and the fact that that wasn't implemented. And I think that it's kind of an open question as to whether or not we'll see backlash against solar in the future in Texas, because what solar does in part is it shaves peak prices, and ERCOT as a system has these sort of peaking hours because of scarcity in the system. At least this is what I was writing about when I was there doing research. And so that means that there are some merchant plants, for example, that could make less money if huge amounts of solar come onto the grid. So I do wonder if there will be some future rules changed at ERCOT, for example, to make it harder for solar. So for now, I think we are in a good moment and that we could see a huge push ahead. But as I've mentioned, and as you mentioned in your comment, it's really a free riding story, right? Yeah, California and China and Germany subsidized solar for Texas, but Texas could have invested in this in 2005. They literally passed a law to do it. And I'll say too that they then tried again in 2007 and 2009, and for various just idiosyncratic reasons, there was a hung session and didn't end up getting passed. So there were efforts many times to try to get this done in Texas, and it just never happened. So I think that that really shows the power of the fossil fuel industry to keep the state behind, and especially if you take 2030 or 2035 as a target for cleaning up the electricity system. I don't really know how Texas is going to move fast enough, but I'm very happy to be wrong because I'd love there to be huge amounts of solar in Texas. And so perhaps that will happen in the future.
Right, thank you. I think my comment on hydropower was more that Texas doesn't even have that option. So.
Oh, I see. Sorry. Yeah.
All right, so we have some other questions here. There's a couple along the lines of enjoying your presentation and wondering what they can do. Are there the other groups to join that are promoting renewables or climate policies, perhaps in Texas or maybe just in general across the country? And how do you think public interest advocates can best advocate for and implement successful clean energy policy at the state level in Texas, given these kinds of things you've been discussing about what might be particular to Texas?
Yeah, well, those are great questions. I think getting involved is really great and important, and especially if you're a student, you have more time, which is awesome. And so using that time, given that you have expertise on this subject, is really great. So some organizations that I really like that you could consider joining are the Sierra Club. They have local chapters all over the country. I'm sure there's some in Texas. 350 is an amazing organization. The Sunrise Movement is one that's fairly focused on young people. So those are some groups that you could think about trying to find a local chapter of and joining, and I really encourage people to do that. In terms of, what was the other half of the question, Carrie, about what can they be pushing, or?
Yes, there's a user here. How do you think public interest advocates can best advocate for clean energy policy in Texas?
I see, yeah. So the story, if you read my book, the first chapter, the happy positive feedback story, is a story of public interest advocates doing a lot of really good work. So it's about Public Citizen and the Environmental Defense Fund. And what's really cool about that story is that it's an inside-outside game, meaning that the Environmental Defense Fund had a lot of ties to legislators in the state, and they were able to get a seat at the table and really help negotiate the language in that 1999 law. But in part, they were able to get a seat at the table because there were groups agitating on the outside and making space for it. So what Public Citizen was doing was that they were tabling in key legislators' districts to try to make sure that this was on their agenda. They were bringing people to go give hearings, talk about asthma and air pollution, because that was another really key reason behind passing this law in 1999, cleaning up the air, because there's really bad air quality in certain parts of Texas, as I'm sure you know. And so when you have this kind of inside-outside game, it can really bolster it. And I think you see that right now in the climate movement. There are groups like Sunrise that are agitating on the outside, right, that are trying to raise the public interest and bring a moral authority of young people to say we need to deal with this. But then there are maybe some other groups who are more on the inside who maybe have specific technical expertise who can go and help try to write legislation. So I think having a nice dialectic between inside and outside groups is really key, and I write about that a bunch in the book. The other thing that they did, which is really cool, is that there was this huge public opinion exercise in the 1990s in Texas to try to figure out what did people think about clean energy. This is very well known. What's interesting when you go back to that record is that, what people thought about clean energy was not all positive, but what advocates did very effectively is that they highlighted all the really positive facts. And so they created a picture of public opinion that made it really positive and that made it seem like there was an enormous amount of support. And there is an enormous amount of support for climate policy and clean energy, but the groups did a really good job communicating that fact. So I think that that's another thing that groups really need to do, is that they need to be smart about public opinion and how they communicate that. And I think that the organization Data for Progress is doing fantastic work along that lines right now. They run regular public opinion polls about climate change and clean energy, and they get it out in the media all the time. And I think that that is a key thing that advocates can do to try to show the big public support that exists for taking on the climate crisis.
Thank you. We get a couple more. One of these is just how can people access this webinar and the recording. And so I'm just showing that the Energy Institute webpage link to the Energy Symposium on the web. So all the videos that we've had over the last 9 years on these symposia are recorded and put online. So they will all be available there. Just a few day delay for us to prepare the video to get online on the website.
Awesome. What a great resource you guys have made. That's fantastic.
Right. So a couple other questions here. Let's see. There's a question about distributed energy resources, particularly maybe in the Texas context, whether this is storage or photovoltaics. What do you see as good policies to get distributed energy as opposed to utility scale type renewables and storage?
Yeah, so Texas doesn't really have a net metering law that most other states have, and so they've struggled with this distributed generation thing. And there are some, and also, right, with the way the retail electricity space works in Texas, I think it's a little complicated. One option is that some retail electricity providers could say we're going to create policies or options for you to be able to sell electricity to the grid and make that an incentive for people to somehow switch their electricity provider, although my understanding is that hasn't happened a lot. There are some utilities like Austin Energy, which in the past at least have had value of solar policies, which is like a net metering policy, but slightly different. And so that can be an incentive for distributed generation. But in general, utilities are pretty anti-distributed generation for lots of reasons that I outline in the book. And net metering laws have come under attack in most states across the country. So, it's a big challenge right now supporting distributed generation projects. And even the Texas build out that Carrie was talking about is likely to happen through really large scale utility plants. Now, some people say that that's better anyway because it's more efficient, but I think we have to think about who's benefiting from that system, and are there ways that we can get, for example, distributed generation in poorer communities, in Black and brown communities, to sort of share some of the wealth associated with the clean energy transition.
Right, thank you. A couple other questions here. What do you think the odds are, or how would you think about carbon standards or carbon tax being implemented, like, I don't know, Texas or maybe across the country? How would this be affected by local level, state regulation, or do we have to think about federal level?
Yeah, so there are some places that have put in carbon prices, particularly on the electricity sector. There's the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the Northeast, and then of course California has their own system, which is more economy-wide, not just the electricity sector. I think a lot of carbon markets have some problems with them. I'm not a huge fan of carbon prices. That said, I was just doing an interesting webinar, like a call with somebody yesterday. He was showing me this new report. And one thing that a carbon price can do is that it can push coal out of the system pretty quickly. And that's a very important thing to do, not just for carbon, but also for air pollution. We know, for example, right now that people living near these big polluting plants, like coal plants, that gets into their lungs because of particulate matter, and it actually makes them at higher risk of dying from coronavirus. So, air pollution is really terrible, and getting rid of coal plants is really critical. So that is something that carbon pricing can do. I think it would need to happen federally to really be comprehensive across the country. And I think that there's big challenges of that, particularly right now when we have so many people out of work and struggling to pay their bills, buy groceries, etc. The thing about a carbon price is it's a regressive tax, meaning that it falls more heavily on poorer people because of the amount of their household budget that goes towards energy versus richer people. And so I think it's going to be a little hard to get that kind of a policy passed when we have such high inequality in this country. And right now with the crisis, people are just going to be struggling. But, I have an essay that's supposed to come out in the Boston Review that goes all into my thoughts around carbon pricing, so you can keep your eyes peeled for that. I have no idea when it's coming out, unfortunately. It's been in production for like 7 months, so yeah, frustrating.
All right, thank you. Maybe we'll try one or two more here. These are kind of, I guess, contemporary issue questions. So one, two different issues, how do you think how they might play out in terms of either renewables or let's just say low carbon energy production in the United States? So one is declining investment tax credits or production tax credits for wind and solar in terms of how the legislation is phasing them out. And the second is just anything about the current pandemic and COVID that I think is good or bad, or maybe it's just all neutral for clean energy.
Great questions. The ITC and PTC issue is really bad. I've been doing some writing and talking about that. It's not something that a lot of people care about, which is sad because it's really important. We have $20 billion annually every year for fossil fuel supports, and the very small supports that we have, which come through tax credits, which are not an ideal way of financing clean energy anyway. These are the investment tax credit and the production tax credit. There was an opportunity in December of last year through the House budget bill to extend them, and it basically failed, which is terrible. Right now with all this stimulus money, you would think that Congress would maybe have this on the agenda. And actually, I think it was slightly on the agenda on the House side, but what happened was, my hypothesis is that the right wing politicized it. Mitch McConnell sort of said, how dare you use this as a political opportunity? And so it didn't end up getting in the bill, which is unfortunate because a lot of the ways that we got really important policies passed were during the Recovery Act in 2009. That's where the 1603 grant program came from. It's where the initial financing for the ARPA-E, the Advanced Research Projects on Energy Agency, came from. So, you know, and the fog of enactment is operating to some degree, right? Like nobody even really knows what's happening with stimulus. Is some of it going to fossil fuels? Where is it going? What businesses are using it? It's a total classic fog of enactment case. But unfortunately, clean energy advocates were not able to get those extensions, and I think it's going to be bad for the industry. Now, some people, including Jigar Shah, have been critical that those aren't really great ways of financing wind and solar at this point, and I think that's valid, but we need something, right? We need some support for the industry. If we need to scale up the industry by like a factor of 8, which is what I argue when I run those calculations with the narwhal curve, you know, you can't be rolling back basic supports while you keep in place fossil fuel subsidies and expect the industry to scale up at the pace that's necessary. So a grants program, for example, would be really great. In terms of the current pandemic, I, along with many other climate people, have not been pushing the idea that this is somehow good for the climate. I think that's wrong. This is not an opportunity to say that. And, you know, a lot of people say, oh, wow, look, carbon emissions are going to fall. What's so crazy is carbon emissions are not going to fall that much. They're going to fall like maybe 4 or 5% is what people are saying. And I think that really calls into question this rhetoric that certain people in the climate movement push constantly, which is it's about individual behavior change. Oh, you know, if you fly or if you drive to work or whatever. Well, guess what? None of us are flying. None of us are driving to work, really, most of us. And carbon emissions are still, what, 95% of normal? So that just shows you that this is really an industrial system issue. It's about policy. It's an institutional and political problem, which is very much what I argue in this book, which means it's really about cleaning up our electricity system, cleaning up the way our homes are fueled, cleaning up the way our transportation is fueled. And that is the one thing I would say is an interesting silver lining, which is certain people, I'm sure there are parts of Texas, maybe Houston being one of them, where there's really bad air quality linked to traffic, linked to driving. People can see right now, you certainly have this in Los Angeles, that when people are not driving, the air is cleaner. And guess what? If we had electric vehicles and electric buses, electric cars, it would be like that every day. So I think that, you know, that shows people that actually if we use the technology that we already have, we could still be driving to work, still be moving around, and having clean air. We don't all need to sit in our homes in order to tackle the climate problem. We need to actually be deploying the technology that we have. And one thing the previous question did not ask was about the EV tax credit. That's another thing that is a huge problem right now. The big manufacturers, I think it's GM and Tesla, they have gone through their limits for their tax credit. And so if you buy an electric vehicle from one of those companies right now, you no longer get a federal incentive. And that is just wrong. So, you know, we are keeping in place fossil fuel supports, and there's some potential that there could be a big bailout for the fossil fuel industry coming down. A lot of people are talking about that. But we're not keeping in place basic supports for electric vehicles, for solar or wind. And I think that that is just backwards policy.
Thanks. Yeah, I agree that we're going to have some interesting statistics here coming out of COVID to understand just what happens if people sort of stay home. You still have to move food around. There's still other kinds of industry going on. So we're going to see exactly how much, well, maybe not exactly, but we're going to see to some degree how much individual, staying at home at least affects things. So this will hopefully learn a lot about behavior. So we still have a couple of good questions here, so we'll just hang on maybe for another 5 or so minutes. You kind of maybe hinted at this to industrial scale or technological solutions. So what do you see in terms of obstacles, or how do you think about the technological solutions to, say, get to 100% low carbon energy? Thinking about things like, okay, yeah, you know, it's easy when you're at 20% or 10%, and when you get 80 or 90% low carbon, then things might be starting to get a little bit more difficult in terms of the cost. So how do you think about the technologies available? Or do we have technological barriers, or do we just have policy barriers, or do we have some economic barriers that we have to think about
Yeah,
or
another
we
great
just don't think about them until we get there at these high penetrations, and then we deal with them at the time. Sorry.
Yeah, well, wow, your students are really on it, man. They got all the questions. I'm very
This is not this is not just a group of students watching. This is a group of professionals and all kinds of people. So
okay, well, that explains it. Well, these professionals in Texas are brilliant. Everybody's smart is what I'm trying to say. And I'm sure there's some brilliant women asking these questions too. Anyway, so yeah, that's a huge question. And again, I had such an interesting call about that with somebody who's coming out with a great report in the coming months on that exact issue. You know, if you've ever looked at the work of Christopher Clack, he's fantastic. He's done really amazing modeling in Minnesota as well as in Colorado. What he shows is that you can actually get to like 80 or 90%. And in some cases, it's actually cheaper than the status quo. The Colorado data was showing that. Pretty fascinating. Some of these coal plants that are still operating are really expensive. If you look at the Southeast, there's, I don't know if it's Energy Innovation that put out this report, but there's a report that shows all the plants that are uneconomic, that are still operating across the Southeast, but really across the whole country. Because monopoly electric utilities are trying to keep them open because that's in their own financial interest and there's no economic pressure. So that's, I guess, one good thing about ERCOT is that you have some of those market signals to theoretically shut down these uneconomic plants. Or you have Ohio, for example, where these uneconomic plants are literally being bailed out. Even though there's a market signal coming in, they're putting billions of dollars into keeping the Samus coal plant and the OVAC coal plants open. So all of which is to say that these, you know, we can actually get huge amounts of clean electricity on the grid for very cheap, according to Christopher Clack's work. And his work is fantastic. You know, he takes in real weather information and does proper, robust modeling to understand what would it be like to operate the grid, both from a capacity expansion and from a grid operation perspective. So I would point you to him. And so then that gets us to what, 80, 90%. And what this report person that I was talking about, which I guess I shouldn't spoil all the findings, not that I'm telling you who wrote it, but you know, we have a fair amount of natural gas infrastructure already. If we can get on top of the methane leakage problem, that could be used as backup for maybe the last 10% or 15%. And you know, that would bring carbon emissions down enormously, particularly if we're also electrifying transportation and cleaning up buildings. So yes, I am of the mindset that focusing so much on the last 10 to 20% problem is, you know, we're going to have new technologies by the time we get there. That's my attitude. Maybe there'll be some breakthroughs in these small modular nuclear reactors. I don't know. Maybe the hydrogen will be the backup source and we'll be using renewables to create that fuel while we have excess supply of renewables, and then we'll use the hydrogen when we don't, burn it, right? I don't necessarily know what the system is, but I definitely think that especially if we can get transmission build out, which of course is a huge challenge if you've read that book, Superpower by Russell Gold. But if we can get the federal government to take transmission seriously, a lot of these problems become a bit easier. So those are my long rambling thoughts on that question.
All right, thank you. Okay, I will really stop at two. The first one's a short question, and then the second one is a normal discussion question. First one is, you mentioned some studies on subsidies. I don't know if you know these off the top of your hand, or perhaps you could say people could email you or something if they wanted to know which studies you're speaking of.
Oh, all the various studies I've been talking about?
Well, you mentioned some on fossil fuel subsidies, I think maybe in particular. I don't know how many you mentioned.
Yeah, often if I write op-eds, I link to specific studies. So the 20 billion, I think that's like this activist group. It's not hard to find if you just Google that. You can find that number really easily. I don't remember the name of the organization that does that. And then the study that I've been talking about is a new one that hasn't come out yet. It's going to come out in like 2 months. And then Christopher Clack's great. I'd also really recommend the work of Stephen Davis. He's a professor at UC Irvine, and he's written really fascinating papers about 1.5 degree targets, about industrial emissions. So I would check out his work as well.
Okay, so here will be the last one. It's hopefully not really two questions, but somewhat related in terms of buyers of, I guess, low carbon or clean energy in some sense. So one question is a little bit maybe particular to California, and can you expand on anything interesting and what you know about community choice aggregation and its role in a low carbon future? And another one here is a little bit more of a Texas story. The University of Texas system, or I don't know if that was University of Lands, signed some of the first wind leases in, say, the year 2000 and 2001. So in some sense, the university system in Texas like to say that they helped create the wind boom because it was the first big customer, or grown up, as this question states, to buy wind energy, and this gives confidence in whoever's going to install the project. So how important is it to have early credentialed customers to validate renewables industry, or perhaps new things that need to happen on larger scale, whether they're storage or whatever the technologies we need are?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. There's been a lot of demand on the customer side. A lot of tech companies have pushed hardcore to try to say they're 100% renewables. This is like Apple and Google, and I think CBS has done this too. There's a bunch of companies like that. Of course, they're not really 100% renewables around the clock yet, but I think that's really great and exciting and important. And that is another way that the renewables are being pushed while we have languished on the sort of ramping up our renewable portfolio standard or clean energy targets over time. So I think customer side stuff can be good. And that also speaks to the CCA question. It's a customer side question. I think it is limited though. I really believe in government policy and institutional policy to set the rules across ideally the whole country, or across the whole state, to make everybody do it, because voluntary policies, whether that's, Google buying renewables or a CCA program, they only get us so far. And we need level playing field, and we need rules that say we've got to get to clean targets by these dates. So there's that. I haven't been a huge booster of CCAs, but yesterday I heard some interesting things about them, and I am open to changing my mind. In the early days of CCAs in Massachusetts and California, they often really struggle to sign real PPAs or to get real new electricity on the grid. And I think that's what ideally we want them to be doing. We want them to be building new stuff, just like we want to force private utilities to build new stuff through RPSs. And unfortunately, and I document this in my book, a lot of RPSs and net metering exempt municipal utilities, rural electric co-ops, and CCAs. And so if you are exiting the system, you need to be having the same requirements to do real stuff as IOUs. Otherwise, what exactly are you doing? And the way that the California RPS was designed is this whole bucket system. And that means that there's real steel in the ground being built in California, including with union jobs, to create new renewables. It's not just, for example, doing resource shuffling where you're bringing in hydro from, let's say, the Northwest and not building new things. And so I think that CCAs have to hold themselves to that standard of building new things. However, yesterday on this call, I had heard that there were some CCAs doing really interesting things, and that the nice thing is they're flexible and they can do stuff quickly. So if they want to do an energy efficiency program, which we know utilities are pretty terrible at doing, they can just do that and they don't have to go through a whole Public Utility Commission hearing. So I think if CCAs are operating at a minimum level and then wanting to do extra, I fully support that. And another thing that this person mentioned to me is that the CCA he was working with also gave bills forgiveness for people struggling with the coronavirus crisis, that they just stopped charging certain people for their electricity. And I think that that's really cool and awesome. And so, CCAs, like any other utility kind of arrangement, can be done poorly and can be done well. And I think that we should have standards where we require them to be building real new things. And if they're doing that and they're pushing beyond what private utilities are doing, fantastic. If they're not doing that, I think that we should be critical and make sure that they are pushing beyond what private utilities are doing.
Okay, thank you very much, Leah. Thank you, Josh, for arranging to help get Leah to come be a part of the speaker series. It was a good discussion, and thank you all for attending. Sorry I didn't get to everybody's questions, but we'll have to call it to an end right now. So thank you again.
Yeah, great questions. Honestly, I was very impressed, and it's lovely to have a conversation remotely with all of you. And anybody working on clean energy and climate advocacy, thank you for your work. I really appreciate it. We all have a role to play to try to drive this faster. So I hope that even though we're having some difficult conversations, that you feel encouraged, because we really do have to change the system faster than we have been.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Carrie and Josh. Really appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you.